My wheelchair hit the freezing water, and through the splash, I heard them claim I had drowned. They laughed about inheriting $23 million, convinced a 76-year-old woman was too weak to survive. They were wrong. I did not die beneath that dock. I simply held my breath and waited. They believe they committed the perfect murder, but all they really did was sign their own death warrants. My name is Marjorie Elwood, and for 40 years I maintained the quiet order of the Hawthorne Community Institute Library, a place where silence was a rule to be respected. Now, at 76 years old, sat in a wheelchair I did not truly need, rolling toward the edge of the dark water in Belford Springs, I realized that silence was not a sign of peace. It was a weapon. The wooden planks of the pier rumbled beneath my wheels, sending tremors up my spine that had nothing to do with the evening chill. I could feel the damp mist clinging to my face, smelling of decaying algae and cold indifference. There were 3 people behind me, their footsteps soft, predatory, and familiar. I felt the hands on the back of my chair tighten. It was not a caress. It was a final adjustment. She drowned. A male voice whispered, the sound sharp against the humid air. Now we get the 23 million. Before I could turn, the world tilted violently. The sky vanished, replaced by the suffocating embrace of the lake. The cold was a physical blow, a shock that usually stops the heart of someone my age, but they had forgotten where I came from. I spent my youth on the Virginia coast, fighting currents stronger than this stagnant lake. As the heavy wheelchair pulled me down into the murky blackness, I did not panic. I waited. With lungs burning, I reached down, my fingers nimble from decades of sorting index cards, and unbuckled the strap. I kicked hard against the footrests, letting the metal chair sink into the silt while I pushed myself sideways, away from the splash zone. I surfaced silently beneath the rotting beams of the pier, gasping for air in small, controlled sips. Above me, the wood creaked as they leaned over the edge. I don't see bubbles. A younger male voice stammered. That was Darren, my cousin. Grant. Are you sure this is right? Shut up, my son-in-law. Grant hissed. It's done. The old hag is gone. We walk away. Now, what about the cameras? This voice broke my heart. It was Evelyn, my daughter. Her voice was trembling, but she was there. She was part of it. Dummy cameras. Grant scoffed. They haven't worked since 2010. Nobody sees a thing. I held onto a barnacle-encrusted pylon, biting my lip until it bled to keep from screaming. Grant was wrong. As a former librarian, I read everything, including the municipal newsletters that others threw away. The Belford Springs Parks Department had upgraded the entire security grid to high-definition night vision sensors 3 weeks ago. They were not standing in a blind spot. They were standing on a stage. I waited until their footsteps faded into the gravel parking lot before I moved. Dragging my body out of the water was the hardest physical task of my life. My joints screamed, and my lungs felt filled with glass. I clawed at the mud of the bank, pulling myself up inch by inch, shivering violently. Water dripped from my woolen cardigan onto the dirt, each drop marking the end of Marjorie the victim. They thought they had written the final chapter of my life tonight. Instead, I had just watched them sign their own confessions. I lay on the grass for a long time, staring up at the indifferent moon. A fire began to kindle in my chest, burning away the shock and the cold. For years, I had been the polite widow, the invisible old woman, the burden. That woman drowned in the lake. The creature that crawled up the bank was something else entirely. I made it back to my house just before dawn, avoiding the streetlights. I was exhausted, my body bruising and battered, but my mind possessed a terrifying clarity. I stripped off the wet clothes, my hands shaking not from fear, but from a cold, hard rage. I was alive, and for the $23 million they thought they had won, I was going to make sure they paid with everything they had. The Victorian house I had shared with my husband for 40 years stood silent around me, but the silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt like the held breath of a witness who had seen too much. The mahogany staircase, once polished to a shine by the feet of children and grandchildren, now seemed steep and foreboding. I walked through the hallway, my wet clothes replaced by a dry flannel nightgown, yet the chill of the lake refused to leave my bones. This house was supposed to be my fortress, but as I looked at the shadows stretching across the floorboards, I realized it had slowly become a cage. I moved into the kitchen to make tea. The act was automatic, a ritual of survival. As I filled the kettle, I watched my hands. They were trembling violently. A younger version of myself might have mistaken this for fear, but at 76, I knew the difference. This was not terror. It was the physical manifestation of a truth so heavy my body struggled to carry it. My daughter wanted me dead. My flesh and blood had stood on a pier and watched me sink. You let them take too much, Marjorie. A voice echoed in my memory. It was Robert, my late husband. He had been gone for 10 years, but tonight his presence was as tangible as the ceramic mug in my hand. I remembered a specific afternoon in the garden, months before his heart gave out. He had looked at me, his eyes clouded with worry, and said, "Silence isn't always a virtue, honey. Sometimes. Sometimes it just tells the wolves you're ready to be eaten." I had dismissed him then. I thought family was sacred. I thought love was a currency that never devalued. I was a fool. Setting the mug down, I walked to the secretaire desk in the living room where the mail usually piled up. Grant, my son-in-law, had insisted on handling my complicated paperwork for the last 2 years. He called it a kindness. I pulled open the bottom drawer, where I knew he stuffed the envelopes he thought I was too senile to understand. I began to tear them open, one by one. Bank statements from Belford Federal Trust, notices of transfer. There were letters here I had never seen, drafts for a power of attorney adjustment, withdrawals that were small enough to go unnoticed by a casual observer, but frequent enough to bleed an account dry. Greed, I whispered to the empty room. It didn't start tonight. The rot had set in the moment Robert died. Without his protective shadow, they saw me not as a mother or a grandmother, but as an obstacle between them and an inheritance. The push into the lake was simply the final, desperate shove of people who had been picking my pockets for a decade. I took my tea to the mantelpiece and stood before the framed photograph of Robert. He was smiling, that confident, crooked grin that used to make me feel safe. They think I'm at the bottom of the lake. Robert, I told the photograph. They think I'm gone. My hand reached out and touched the glass. I won't be silent anymore. I promised him. I am going to burn their world down, piece by piece. I looked at the phone on the side table. The receiver sat there, offering a direct line to the police. It would be so easy to dial 911. They would come. They would arrest Grant and Darren, but Evelyn, she would play the victim, and the money that figure they mentioned on the dock remained a mystery. 23 million, I murmured. We never had that kind of money. Robert was a successful engineer, but $23 million was a fortune that belonged in movies, not in the bank accounts of a retired librarian. Where did it come from? Why did they think they would get it only if I drowned? If I called the police now, the investigation would be clumsy. Lawyers would get involved. Grant would lie. No. Let them think I am dead. A ghost can go places. The living cannot. A ghost can listen through keyholes and open safes without suspicion. I turned off the kitchen light. For the first time in 10 years, I walked up the stairs without turning on the hallway lamp. I was no longer afraid of the dark. The monsters were not in the shadows. They were sleeping in their beds, dreaming of spending my money. I climbed into my cold sheets, my mind racing with plans, calculating my next move with the precision of the librarian I used to be. I closed my eyes, and for the first time since Robert died, I did not pray for peace. I prayed for justice. The morning sun filtered through the dust motes of my study, illuminating the stack of papers I had spread across the oak desk. It did not take a forensic accountant to see the crime. It only took a pair of eyes that were finally open. There, sitting atop a pile of bank statements, was a document titled Power of Attorney. It was dated 4 months ago. At the bottom, my name was scrawled in a shaky, hesitant hand that mocked my actual signature. Grant had not just stolen from me. He had erased my agency long before he pushed me into the water. I dressed with deliberate care, choosing a charcoal suit I had not worn since Robert's funeral. I called a taxi, bypassing the car that sat in the garage, and directed the driver to Belford Federal Trust. The bank had held the Elwood family assets for 30 years, a place where the tellers used to give lollipops to my grandchildren. Today, it was a crime scene. When I walked into the lobby, the air conditioning hit me, sharp and sterile. I bypassed the line and went straight to the glass-walled office of the branch manager, Mr. Carlyle. He looked up, his face registering a mixture of shock and confusion as he saw me standing there, leaning on my cane, but very much alive. Mrs. Elwood, he stammered. Standing up so quickly, his chair rolled back and hit the filing cabinet. Grant told us you were... Well, he said you were bedridden. Grant says a lot of things. Mr. Carlyle, I said, my voice steady. Most of them are lies. I need to see my transaction history. All of it, going back 5 years. He hesitated, his eyes darting to the phone on his desk. I really should call Mr. Morell. He has the power of attorney on file, and he gave strict instructions about... If you touch that phone, I interrupted, stepping closer to the glass. I will file a formal complaint with the Federal Regulatory Board before lunch. That document you have on file is a forgery. Now, open the accounts. Mr. Carlyle turned pale. He typed his password with trembling fingers. I watched the screen as the numbers scrolled by. It was worse than I had imagined. It was a hemorrhage. Thousands of dollars were siphoned off monthly under vague labels like consulting fees and maintenance retainers. What is the Nexus Group? I asked, pointing a gloved finger at a recurring transfer of $5,000. I assumed it was for your medical care, Mr. Carlyle said, sweat beading on his forehead. Grant said it was for private nursing. I have never had a private nurse in my life. I replied coldly, keep scrolling. Then we found it. A loan. A massive, secured loan taken out against the equity of my house, finalized 6 months ago. $500,000. I read the number aloud, tasting the bitterness of the betrayal. He took out a $500,000 loan in my name. He said it was to settle a family business debt. Mr. Carlyle whispered, looking like he might be sick. He used the general power of attorney, Mrs. Elwood. If this is fraudulent, the bank could be liable. You are liable, I said. Freeze it. Freeze everything. The checking accounts, the savings, the investment portfolio. If a single penny leaves this bank, or if anyone, especially my son-in-law, tries to access it, you call me immediately. I watched him type the commands, locking down the assets that Grant and Evelyn thought they had already secured. This was not just about murder anymore. The $23 million they spoke of at the lake was likely the only way Grant planned to pay off this massive debt before the bank seized the house. They didn't just want me dead to get rich. They needed me dead to stay out of prison. Print them, I ordered. I want physical copies of every single transaction. I want the loan application. I want the signature card. Mr. Carlyle handed me a thick manila envelope 10 minutes later. He looked terrified. Mrs. Elwood, I am so sorry. I didn't know. I took the envelope. It felt heavy, like a weapon. Ignorance is not a defense, Mr. Carlyle, I told him. It is just another form of complicity. I walked out of the bank into the bright mid-morning light. The rush of traffic sounded different now. It sounded like opportunity. I clutched the envelope to my chest. Grant thought he was playing a game of chess with a senile old woman, but he had forgotten that I was the one who taught him how to play. I felt a cold, sharp smile spread across my face. The money was frozen. The trap was set. Now, I just had to wait for the rats to realize the cheese was gone. I returned to my house shortly after noon. The heavy envelope from the bank pressed against my side like a shield. As the taxi pulled away, I saw a familiar sedan parked haphazardly in my driveway. It was a flashy red sports car that cost more than my first house, a vehicle that screamed of insecurity and debt. Darren was sitting on my front porch steps, his head in his hands, bouncing his leg with a nervous energy that rattled the loose floorboards. When he saw me approach, he jumped up, smoothing his expensive jacket with sweaty palms. I stopped at the bottom of the walkway. I looked at him, really looked at him, and the image of the previous night superimposed itself over his face. I could still feel the cold water. I could still hear his voice trembling in the dark, asking if they were sure I was gone. Now, in the daylight, he looked less like a killer and more like a frightened child who had broken a vase and was waiting to see if anyone had noticed. Aunt Marjorie, he exclaimed, his voice cracking slightly. He forced a smile that didn't reach his darting eyes. I was worried about you. Evelyn said she couldn't reach you all morning. I was running errands. Darren, I said, my voice flat and devoid of the warmth I used to reserve for him. What do you want? He flinched at the sharpness of my tone. He was used to the Marjorie who baked cookies and slipped him $50 bills for his birthday. He was not prepared for the Marjorie who had clawed her way up a muddy riverbank. Right. Well, he stammered, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a crumbled document. It's actually about that investment opportunity I told you about last Christmas. The tech startup. We need a bridge loan, just a signature to guarantee the liquidity. It's urgent. I mean, really urgent. I watched his hands. They were shaking. He wasn't here for an investment. He was here because the $23 million hadn't materialized yet, and the debts he had racked up were coming due. He needed a lifeline because he thought he had killed the golden goose, and now that the goose was standing in front of him, he was trying to pluck one last feather. I walked past him, unlocking the front door with steady hands. No. He followed me into the foyer, his panic rising. What do you mean? No, Aunt Marjorie. It's a sure thing. You just sign, and we handle the rest. You won't even know the money is moved. I said no. Darren. I turned to face him, leaning on my cane, standing as tall as my spine would allow. I am not signing anything. Not today. Not ever again. For the first time in his life, I looked at him without a shred of pity. I saw him for what he was, a weak, greedy man who had held the back of my wheelchair and pushed. But Grant said this would be easy. Darren blurted out, his face flushing a deep crimson. He said you weren't all there. He said you'd just sign it if we told you it was for the house insurance. The silence that followed his outburst was deafening. He covered his mouth, realizing too late that he had deviated from the script. Grant said I wasn't all there, I asked softly, stepping closer to him. I didn't mean... Look, Aunt Marjorie, please. He was pleading now, sweat dripping down his temple. I need this. If I don't get this signature by 5 o'clock, they're going to... I'm in trouble. We are all in trouble. Darren, I said. Some of us just know it better than others. What is that supposed to mean? He whispered, backing away toward the door. Why are you looking at me like that? You should go. I told him. I didn't scream. I didn't threaten. I simply stared at him with the cold indifference of the lake he had tried to drown me in. You're acting weird, he muttered, fumbling for the doorknob. Grant was right. You're losing it. We're going to have to make the arrangements sooner than we thought. He realized his mistake the second the words left his mouth. He had just admitted there were arrangements. He had just confirmed the timeline was flexible. He scrambled out the door, nearly tripping over his own feet, and ran to his car. I watched him peel out of the driveway, his tires screeching against the asphalt. He was terrified. He had come here expecting a confused old woman, and instead, he had found a wall of ice. I closed the heavy oak door and turned the deadbolt. Click. Then the chain, slide. I walked into the living room and sat down at my desk. I opened my journal and picked up my pen. My hand was steady as I wrote down every word he had said, marking the time 1:45 in the afternoon. Grant said it would be easy. Arrangements sooner than thought. They were panicked. Chaos was beginning to fracture their alliance. I closed the book and stared at the front door. They had no idea that the woman inside was no longer their victim. I was the witness, the judge, and soon, I would be the executioner. The wind off the lake no longer felt like a threat as I stepped out of the taxi at the Belford Springs Marina. Just 12 hours ago, this water had been my intended grave. Now, under the stark light of the afternoon sun, it was merely a crime scene waiting to be processed. I walked toward the harbour master's office, my cane striking the wooden planks with a rhythmic thud that sounded like a gavel hitting a bench. The new manager, Helene Ward, was a sharp-eyed woman in her late 40s who had taken over the post only a month prior. She looked up from her paperwork as I entered, her professional smile faltering for a fraction of a second when she saw the bruise blooming along my jawline. Mrs. Elwood, Helene asked, standing up. I heard there was an incident last night. Someone found a wheelchair washed up near the reeds this morning. We were about to call the family. The family knows, I said, my voice steady and cold. I need to see your security footage from last night. Specifically, the feed from the North Pier between 9 and 10 o'clock. Helene hesitated, her eyes scanning my face. She saw something there that made her abandon protocol. It was not the fragility of an old woman. It was the intensity of a survivor. The police usually request that, she said softly. The police will see it, I replied. But I need to see it first. She nodded slowly and motioned for me to come around the counter. She typed a command into the new security terminal. Grant had been so arrogant, so sure that the cameras were dummies left over from the previous administration. He had not bothered to check the town council meeting minutes where the budget for the new high-definition surveillance system was approved. The screen flickered to life. The black and white image was crisp. There, I pointed. We watched in silence. The timestamp read 9:15. The camera, mounted discreetly on a utility pole Grant had likely dismissed, captured the entire scene. We saw the three figures. We saw the wheelchair. We saw the hesitation of the younger man, Darren, and the rigid posture of my daughter, Evelyn. And then we saw Grant on the screen. My son-in-law leaned forward. The shove was violent, deliberate, and undeniable. Helene gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Oh my God. That wasn't an accident. He pushed you. I watched my own attempted murder with a detachment that surprised me. I did not shake. I did not look away. I studied the frame like a librarian analyzing a misfiled book. I saw the license plate of Grant's car clearly illuminated by the motion sensor light they had triggered upon exit. I saw the exact moment they turned and walked away, leaving me to die. He tried to kill me, I stated simply. I'm calling the sheriff, Helene said, reaching for the phone, her fingers trembling. No, I said, placing my hand over hers. Not yet. But Mrs. Elwood, you are in danger, she whispered, her eyes wide with horror. I was in danger yesterday. Helene, today. I am the danger, I told her. I need a copy of that footage, and I need you to keep the original safe. Can you do that for me? She looked at the screen, then back at me, and nodded vigorously. I'll make you 2 copies. I'll put the master drive in the safe. Nobody touches it but you. 10 minutes later, I walked out of the office with a USB drive in my purse. I had the license plate numbers. I had the time of death they had tried to assign to me. I had the faces of my executioners. I had enough evidence to send Grant, Evelyn, and Darren to prison for the rest of their natural lives. But as I walked back toward the road, a thought nagged at me. Prison was too easy. If I arrested them now, the story would end. But the story was incomplete. Why $23 million, my husband, Robert, had been a successful man. But our estate was worth perhaps $2 million, mostly tied up in the house and life insurance. Where did that specific astronomical number come from? Grant was greedy. But he was also an accountant. He wouldn't invent a number like that out of thin air. I clutched my purse tighter. The video proved they tried to kill me, but it didn't explain why the price on my head was so high. There was a secret buried in my financial history, something Robert had perhaps hidden or something Grant had found. And I realized I could not close the trap until I knew exactly what piece of cheese they were chasing. I was not just going to send them to jail. I was going to find out what they were really afraid of. The leather chair in Leonard Breyer's office creaked as I sat down, a sound that brought back a flood of memories from when Robert and I used to come here to update our wills. Leonard was older now, his hair completely white, but his eyes behind the thick tortoiseshell glasses were as sharp as ever. When I finished telling him the story, placing the USB drive on his mahogany desk, he did not say a word for a long time. He simply stared at the small silver device, his face draining of colour. "They actually did it," Leonard whispered, his voice rough with emotion. I knew Grant was ambitious. Marjorie. I knew he was aggressive, but I never thought he was a monster. He is a man who ran out of patience. "Leonard," I said, "and I need you to keep that safe. If anything happens to me again." That video goes to the district attorney. Leonard nodded solemnly. He stood up, walked to the large steel safe behind his desk, and locked the drive inside. When the tumbler clicked shut, I felt a fraction of the weight lift from my shoulders. "Now," Leonard said, returning to his seat and pulling a stack of files toward him. "We need to understand why. You mentioned $23 million. Marjorie, your liquid assets are substantial, but they don't reach that figure. I've been looking into the old trust archives since you called me this morning." He opened a dusty file folder. Inside were documents that smelled of age and legal stagnation. "Do you remember the environmental lawsuit from 1995? The one against the chemical plant where Robert was a silent partner?" Leonard asked. "I remember the headaches," I replied. "I remember Robert saying it would take decades to resolve." "It did," Leonard said, tapping a specific line on a spreadsheet. "The settlement was finalized 3 years ago, but the payout was structured into a 20-year maturity trust to minimize tax liability for the surviving spouses. It's a blind trust. Marjorie, you weren't supposed to know the exact value until the maturity date." He turned the paper toward me. "The maturity date is next week," Leonard said. "The principal, plus the accrued interest over 2 decades, comes to exactly $23,400,000. The room seemed to spin. Grant had not just stumbled upon an opportunity. He had been tracking this date. He knew that if I were alive when the trust matured, the money would go into my personal accounts, fully under my control. But if I died before the maturity date, the bylaws of the trust stated it would bypass the estate process and dissolve immediately to the next of kin. He didn't just want the money, I said, my voice barely a whisper. He needed me dead before next Tuesday. If you are alive next week, you control the fortune. If you are dead, Evelyn inherits it, and Grant controls Evelyn. Leonard clarified, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. This was planned. Marjorie. He has likely been counting down the days for years. A cold fury settled in my chest. This was not a crime of passion. It was an accounting error correction in Grant's ledger. I was just a line item to be deleted. I want to change the beneficiary, I said firmly. Immediately. I want to transfer the power of attorney and the executorship of my entire estate, including this trust, to someone who isn't trying to drown me. Who, Leonard asked, picking up his pen. Evelyn is compromised. Sophia, I said. My niece? She is 28 years old. She works hard, and she is the only person in this family who has never asked me for a dime. She has a backbone. Leonard? She stood up to Grant at Christmas when he made a joke about her car. I trust her. Leonard began drafting the documents immediately. We can file an emergency injunction to block Grant's access. But this is going to be a war, Marjorie. When he realizes the money isn't coming, when he realizes you are fighting back, he is going to come at you with everything he has. Are you ready for that? I looked at the empty spot on the desk where the evidence of my murder attempt had been. I thought about the cold water. I thought about the silence of the lake. Let him come, I said. And for the first time in days, I smiled. He thinks he is fighting a confused old woman. He has no idea he is fighting the person who owns the bank he is trying to rob. The phone had been ringing for 3 days. At first, it was Grant, aggressive and demanding. Then, it was Darren, frantic and pleading. But for the last 24 hours, the caller ID simply displayed Evelyn, my daughter, the girl I had taught to tie her shoes, the woman who had stood on a wooden pier and watched her husband push me into the water. I let it ring. I needed her fear to marinate. I needed the silence to become unbearable for her, just as it had been for me under the surface of the lake. When I finally heard the tires crunch on the gravel driveway, I was sitting in the parlour, knitting a scarf I would never wear. I didn't lock the door. I wanted her to come in. Evelyn burst through the entryway, her hair unwashed and pulled back in a severe bun, her eyes rimmed with red. She looked 10 years older than she had just a week ago. She didn't look like a conspirator. She looked like a ghost haunting her own life. "Mum," she gasped, dropping her keys on the floor. "Oh my God, you're here. You're okay." Grant said you wandered off. He said you were confused. I am perfectly lucid. "Evelyn," I said, not looking up from my needles. "Grant says a lot of things. I am surprised you still listen." She froze, the air leaving her lungs in a sharp hiss. She walked slowly into the room, wringing her hands, a nervous habit she had inherited from her father, which now only served to remind me of how much she had dishonored his memory. I was so worried," she stammered, tears spilling over. "I thought, you thought I was dead?" I stopped knitting and looked at her. "Or you hoped I was?" "No," she cried out, falling onto the sofa opposite me. "No, Mom. I never wanted that. I swear. I was so scared. Scared I asked, my voice low and dangerous. You were standing right there. Evelyn, I heard you. You asked about the cameras? You didn't ask if I was okay? You didn't scream for help? You worried about being caught?" Evelyn buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. I couldn't stop him. You don't know what he's like. Mom, he screams. He throws things. He told me we were going to lose everything. The house, the cars. He said we were bankrupt. He said it was a mercy. That you wouldn't want to live in a state facility. A mercy, I repeated, tasting the bile of the word. So, drowning your mother in a stagnant lake was an act of kindness. I'm sorry. She sobbed, the sound raw and ugly. I am so sorry. I'm a coward. I know I am. But he made me sign papers. Piles of them. I don't even know what I signed anymore. I just wanted him to stop yelling. I looked at my daughter. Really looked at her. I saw the bruises on her wrist she tried to hide with her sleeve. I saw the terror that lived in her eyes, not terror of me, but terror of the man waiting for her at home. She was broken. Grant had not just stolen my money, he had hollowed out my daughter until she was nothing but a vessel for his greed. Did he tell you about the money? Evelyn, I asked softly. She looked up, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. Confused. Money, Mom. There is no money. That's why. That's why he was so desperate. He owes people. Bad people. The $23 million? I said. The room went dead silent. Evelyn's brow furrowed. 23 million, what are you talking about? She didn't know. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Grant hadn't shared his master plan with her. To him, she was just another loose end, another pawn to be used and discarded. He had convinced her they were destitute, justifying murder as a desperate necessity, while he secretly waited for a fortune she didn't even know existed. He didn't tell you, I said. And for the first time, my voice held a trace of pity. He planned to kill me to trigger a trust fund payout. $23 million, Evelyn. He wasn't trying to save you from poverty. He was trying to make himself rich. Evelyn stared at me, her mouth slightly open, the horror of the truth slowly sinking in. No. That's impossible, he said. He lied. I cut her off. He has been lying to you for years, and you let him. You let him turn you into an accomplice to your own mother's murder because you were too afraid to ask a single question. I didn't know, she whispered, her voice trembling. Mom. Please. I didn't know. Ignorance does not wash the blood off your hands. Evelyn, I said, standing up. My legs felt heavy, but I stood tall. But it does explain why you are still alive. If he had told you about the money, you would probably be at the bottom of that lake with me. She flinched, but she didn't look away. She sat there, shattered, stripping away the layers of denial she had wrapped herself in. I can't go back there. She choked out. I can't go back to him. Then don't, I said. I walked to the window and looked out at the grey sky. But do not think for 1 second that this fixes us. You watched me die. Evelyn. That is a silence I will hear for the rest of my life. She nodded, tears streaming silently down her face now. We stood in the quiet of the old house, 2 women bound by blood and separated by betrayal. She was a victim, yes, but she was also the woman who stood on the dock. I could see she wanted forgiveness. But as I looked at her, I knew that was a bridge we were not yet ready to cross. I was not ready to be her mother again. Not yet. First, I had to be her savior, and to do that, I had to destroy her husband. The pounding on my front door didn't sound like a visitor. It sounded like a battering ram. It was 6 o'clock in the evening, and the sky was already bruising into a deep purple. I knew who it was before I even stood up. The rhythm of the knocks screamed entitlement and panic in equal measure. I didn't rush. I placed my tea on the coaster, smoothed my skirt, and walked to the door with the deliberate pace of a woman who owned her time. When I opened it, Grant practically fell into the hallway. His tie was loosened, his hair was a mess, and his face was flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. He didn't even say hello. He just loomed over me, trying to use his height as a weapon, a tactic that might have worked a week ago. "What the hell did you do?" Grant roared, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I was at the bank. My cards were declined. They said the accounts are frozen. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that is?" "I imagine it is quite inconvenient," I said, leaning on my cane and looking him dead in the eye. "But perhaps not as inconvenient as drowning." He froze. The bluster drained out of him for a second, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. But he shook it off quickly. He was a man used to bulldozing through reality to suit his narrative. "You're talking nonsense again." "Marjorie," he hissed, stepping closer, invading my personal space. "This is exactly why we need to take control. You are not well. You are confused. I am going to call Dr. Evans. We are going to have you evaluated. You are a danger to yourself. I am a danger." "Grant." I interrupted him, my voice razor-sharp, but not to myself. I walked past him into the living room, forcing him to follow me. I didn't offer him a seat. I stood by the fireplace, the very spot where he had asked for my hand in marriage to my daughter 20 years ago. "I went to the marina today," I said calmly. Grant stopped dead in his tracks, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "So you like the water. Everyone knows that." "I saw the footage." "Grant." I told him. I watched the blood drain from his face. "The cameras on the North Pier are not dummies. They were upgraded last month. High definition. Night vision. I saw you. I saw Darren. I saw you push me." That's a lie," he stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. "It was dark. You fell. We tried to save you. I have the video." "Grant," I said, cutting through his lies. "I have it on a hard drive. My lawyer has a copy in a safe, and another copy is with a third party you will never find." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. The arrogance was crumbling, revealing the desperate, small man beneath. He looked around the room as if searching for an exit strategy, and then his eyes narrowed. He found the one weapon he thought he still had. "Evelyn." He sneered, a cruel smile touching his lips. "She was there. Marjorie." She watched. "If you go to the police, if you show them that video, she goes down with me. Conspiracy to commit murder. Is that what you want? Do you want to send your precious daughter to prison?" "Evelyn didn't know about the $23 million, I said. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Grant's smirk vanished. "She thought you were broke." I continued, taking a step toward him. "She thought you were drowning in debt. She didn't know you were waiting for a trust fund to mature next Tuesday. She didn't know this was a cold-blooded financial transaction. You used her fear to make her an accomplice. But the law looks very differently on coercion versus premeditated greed." "You can't prove that," he whispered, sweat beading on his upper lip. "I don't have to prove it to the police right now," I said. "I just have to prove it to a jury. And with the video and the bank records I pulled today, showing the loans you took out in my name, you are done. Grant." He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw terror. Real, primal terror. He realized he wasn't arguing with his mother-in-law anymore. He was arguing with a witness. Marjorie. "Wait." He started, holding his hands up, his voice trembling. We can work this out. I can explain. It's not what it looks like." "Get out," I said. "Please. I have nowhere to go. The house is in your name. My accounts are frozen. Marjorie." "Get out of my house," I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat with the force of 10 years of silence. He flinched as if I had struck him. He looked at the door, then back at me, seeing the absolute resolve in my eyes. He turned and ran. He didn't walk. He fled. I followed him to the door and slammed it shut, throwing the bolt with a satisfying metallic clack. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door, breathing heavily. It was done. The parasite had been severed. I walked to the phone and dialed a familiar number. "Leonard," I said when he answered. "He knows. It is time to hand everything over to the police." I walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. Grant was standing by his car in the driveway, looking back at the house. He looked small. He looked defeated. He thought he could push a 76-year-old woman into the dark and walk away with a fortune. He forgot that darkness is where the truth learns to fight back. He got in his car and drove away. But we both knew there was nowhere left for him to run. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers painted the walls of my living room in a chaotic rhythm. But I sat on my floral sofa with my hands folded in my lap, perfectly still. Detective Miller, a weary-looking man who had seen too much of the town's ugly side, sat opposite me. He had his notepad out, but he wasn't writing. He was staring at me, likely trying to reconcile the report of a confused, elderly woman with the sharp, articulate person sitting before him. "Mrs. Elwood," he said, clicking his pen. "I want to be clear. You are accusing your son-in-law and your nephew of attempted murder. I am not accusing them of anything." "Detective," I replied, my voice steady, "I am simply reporting a crime. I have provided you with the location, the time, and the motive. The evidence is on the table." I pointed to the copy of the USB drive Leonard had prepared. Miller picked it up and handed it to his partner, who plugged it into their field laptop. The room went silent as the video played. I didn't need to watch it again. I watched their faces instead. I saw Miller's eyes widen. I saw his partner wince as the wheelchair tipped over the edge of the pier. "Jesus." Miller muttered under his breath. "They didn't even look back." "No," I said. "They didn't. They assumed the lake would do their work for them. The machinery of justice, once rusted shut by my silence, began to turn with terrifying speed. Within 2 hours, the radio on Miller's shoulder crackled to life. They had found Grant. He was not at home. He had been apprehended at a motel on the outskirts of town, frantically trying to transfer funds that were no longer accessible. "We got him," the voice on the radio said. "He is kicking and screaming. Says it's a setup. Bring him in," Miller ordered. Darren was picked up 20 minutes later at a bar downtown. Unlike Grant, he didn't fight. According to the report I heard later, he collapsed into the arresting officer's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. I didn't want to. Darren had apparently wailed as they cuffed him. Grant made me. He said it was the only way by the next morning. The news had shattered the quiet facade of Belford Springs. A town that prided itself on potlucks and church fundraisers was suddenly the center of a sensational story about matricide and millions. My phone rang incessantly, but I didn't answer. I had a permanent protection order issued against Grant, though it was hardly necessary. He was currently sitting in a holding cell with a bail set so high he would need another 20 lifetimes to pay it. Evelyn went to the station voluntarily. I was told she looked small in the interrogation room. She didn't ask for a lawyer. She asked for a pen. She laid out every fraudulent document Grant had forced her to sign, every lie he had told her about our finances. She wasn't innocent, but she was cooperating. He told me. He told me Mom was sick. Evelyn told the investigators. Her voice recorded on the transcript Leonard showed me later. He said she was suffering. He said it would be a mercy. 3 days later. Leonard came to my house. He looked tired, but triumphant. He placed a thick file on my coffee table. Grant's lawyer is trying to plead insanity. Leonard said, taking a sip of the coffee I offered. But it won't stick. Not with Darren testifying against him. Darren took a plea deal this morning. He admitted everything. The planning, the financial motive, the rehearsal. He gave them the timeline. Marjorie. They had been planning this for 6 months. 6 months, I repeated. The number hung in the air. For half a year, while I was knitting sweaters and pouring tea, they were deciding which pier had the deepest water. It is over. Marjorie. Leonard said softly. The district attorney says it is an open and shut case. Grant will likely get 25 years to life. Darren will get 10. You won. I looked around my empty house. The silence was back, but it was different now. It wasn't the silence of a victim waiting to die. It was the silence of a battlefield after the cannons had stopped firing. I had won. I had my life. I had my money. But the victory felt cold. I won, I said, looking at the empty spot on the mantel where a family photo used to sit. But I have to figure out what to do with the prize. Leonard leaned forward, his expression serious. You are 76 years old. Marjorie. You have $23 million coming to you next week. You have a second chance at life that very few people get. The question isn't about the trial anymore. The question is, who are you going to be now that you don't have to be a victim? I looked out the window at the garden, where the first frost of winter was beginning to coat the grass. I don't know yet. Leonard, I said. And for the first time, I felt a spark of genuine excitement mixed with the pain. But I think I'm going to enjoy finding out. The last box I taped shut was not heavy, but it carried the weight of 40 years. I walked through the empty rooms of the Victorian house in Belford Springs one final time. The silence here was no longer the oppressive quiet of a crime scene. It was simply the stillness of a place that no longer held my life. I left the keys on the kitchen counter, right where Grant used to toss his leather briefcase with that arrogant thud. I did not look back as I walked out the door. I did not cry. The woman who might have cried had drowned in the lake months ago, and the woman who drove away was made of something much harder. I moved 3 hours south to a small, weathered cottage in Seabrook Ridge. It is a town that smells of salt and pine, where nobody knows my name, and nobody looks at me with that pitying expression reserved for victims. Here, I am just the lady who walks along the dunes at sunrise. I sit on my new porch, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, watching the Atlantic Ocean crash against the rocks. The water here is wild and living, nothing like the stagnant, murky deadness of the lake. I have learned that survival is not a stroke of luck. It is a choice you make every single time your lungs scream for air and you decide to take one more breath. Sophia visited me last Sunday. She drove down in her modest sedan, looking like a breath of fresh air. She sat with me on the porch, holding a folder of documents. It is all done. Aunt Marjorie, Sophia said, her voice bright with relief. The $23 million has been transferred. The Robert Elwood Engineering Scholarship is fully funded. We are going to put 50 kids through college this year. Uncle Robert, he would have loved this. I smiled, taking her hand. And Grant, he pleaded guilty, Sophia said, her expression darkening slightly. 20 years. Darren got 8. It is over. Good, I said simply. I did not feel joy. I felt balance. The scales had finally tipped back to center. Sophia hesitated, reaching into her bag. Evelyn sent a letter. She, She asked me to give it to you. She is working at a diner in the city. She is trying. Aunt Marjorie? I looked at the envelope. It was cream-coloured, written in Evelyn's looping, anxious handwriting. I took it, but I did not open it. Tell her I received it, I said. You aren't going to read it? Sophia asked gently. Not today, I replied, placing it on the table. Forgiveness is a destination. Sophia. I am just not there yet. I am still learning how to be safe. After Sophia left, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea. The local news in Belford Springs was likely still buzzing with the scandal, dissecting the fall of the prominent Elwood family. But here, the only news was the tide. I opened the window to let the night air in. The rhythmic sound of the waves filled the room. In that sound, for the first time in a decade, I felt him. It wasn't a ghost. It was a memory so strong it felt like a touch on my shoulder. You stood up. I heard Robert's voice in the crash of the surf. You finally stood up. I sat down at my small oak desk and opened a fresh notebook. I picked up my pen. I was not writing a diary to complain about the past. I was writing a manual. I wrote the first sentence. They always think the old are weak, until they realize that age is just a layer of armor we have spent a lifetime forging. I put the pen down and walked out the back door. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. I walked down the wooden steps to the sand, my cane sinking slightly with each step, but my legs were strong. I walked right to the water's edge. The cold foam rushed over my feet. But I did not flinch. I was not afraid of the water anymore. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the sharp, salty air of freedom. They had pushed a wheelchair into a lake, thinking they were disposing of a burden. They were wrong. They had simply baptized a warrior. I turned and walked back toward my warm, lit house, knowing with absolute certainty that no one would ever be able to push me down again. Thank you so much for listening to Marjorie's story. I'm really curious to know where you folks are tuning in from today. Drop a comment down below with your city or country. Let's see how far this story has traveled. If you enjoyed this journey of justice and revenge, please make sure to hit that subscribe button for Grandma's Family Diary, smash that like button, and give us a hype to help this video reach even more people. See you in the next story.